Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, positive and concrete progress after Sunday's trade talks between China and the U.S. After pulling from the brink of a trade war, how close are the two sides to a comprehensive trade deal? China reiterates long-time support for the work of the Red Cross in times of natural and man-made disasters. I catch up with the ICRC President Peter Maurer, who talks about rallying support from all parties for humanitarian missions. Let's begin our program today in Beijing, where the latest round of trade talks between China and the U.S. has wrapped up over the weekend. After Sunday's meeting between Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, the Chinese side made a statement saying positive and concrete progress was made. The statement also warned any agreements will be void if Washington moves ahead with tariffs.
A new round of talks trying to settle the trade disputes. The world's two largest economies sat once again at the negotiation table and achieved positive results. U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said the trade talks have been friendly and frank. He came to Beijing for talks after the Trump administration renewed tariff threats against China. It could affect Chinese goods of a total worth $50 billion. After the negotiations, China's Xinhua news agency made a short statement. It said the two sides had good communication on implementing the consensus reached in Washington. It also said both sides have made concrete progress in many areas such as agriculture and energy. However, the relevant details have yet to be confirmed by both sides. Last month, during Chinese Vice Premier Liu He's visit to Washington, the two sides agreed on meaningful increases in U.S. agriculture and energy exports. But China also suggested in the statement that the achievements reached by the two sides should be based on the premise that the two countries will not fight a trade war. And if the U.S. continues with trade sanctions, including tariffs, all the economic and trade agreements will be void. The Xinhua statement added that China's attitude has been consistent, which is that it's willing to increase imports from all other countries, including the U.S., and China will not change the rhythm of its reform and opening up. The trade disputes have been going on for months now, and the talks this time are expected to pull the two countries back from the brink of a trade war.
So, how close or far away are China and the U.S. to a comprehensive trade deal? Let's ask our panelists. With us in Beijing, Zhang Jianping, Director of the Center for Regional Cooperation with the Chinese Ministry of Commerce. Welcome, sir. Also in Beijing, Edward Xie, CEO of Gaofeng Advisory. Welcome as well. And also in Washington, D.C., Steve Preet, the Managing Partner at Watts Partners. Welcome. Mr. Preet, I want to begin with you. What do you make of the statement at the end of the day between the two sides for this round?
Well, I think the Chinese are being very clear in communicating their position, and I think there's good cause for doing that because they know and have seen that back-channel communications, sometimes even communications through various cabinet officials and representatives, don't always register, if you will, with the President of the United States. So I think they're being very clear and hoping that through their media statements, plus their communication with Secretary Ross, that the message gets through here, that this is serious, that the Chinese are going to maintain their positions on a number of issues, and that's what negotiations are supposed to work out.
Right. At the end of the day, we did see the word tariff being mentioned in the statement coming from the Chinese side, suggesting if tariffs being exercised, all the trade agreements, the two sides, as a result of negotiation, will be void. Tariffs have been the key word by the Trump administration in its latest interactions about international trade, not just with China, but with other countries as well. Mr. Zhang, this is a big issue, in a way. Why and how tariffs become the mainstream now? Because it has been a very backward and outdated word.
Actually, during the election of president in the U.S. 2 years ago, actually Trump already claimed that he will impose tariffs on those products made in China, 45%. That was very amazing for all of scholars and
It's not amazing; it's scary.
Yeah.
But the question is tariffs? The word being used repeatedly in these days trade negotiations and interactions. Are we seeing a healthy trend of resolving the problem, or are we seeing we are going backward rather, Mr.
Actually, for Trump administration, this is a wrong way, for...
Why would you say so?
I mean, tariff cannot solve the problems of trade deficit from the U.S. All of those mainstream economists in the U.S. already, provided their suggestions to the president. Also, that between China and the U.S., our economic structure decided that only by China's, import increasing, can make more balanced trade relationship between two economies. Also, from Chinese side, if we can, invest much more in the U.S., also that would be more balanced, international payment for two countries' economies.
Solution is one thing. The way of trying to negotiate is another thing. But even look at the way of negotiation, Mr. Puig, the threat of tariff. Is that a healthy way for negotiation? Is that the way that should lead the trend of today's trade negotiations?
Well, I think first and foremost you have to separate what is going on here. Number one, you have trade negotiations, which are certainly important, and they're ongoing. Secondly, the administration, and particularly the White House, is running a communications drill here in an attempt to send messages back to their constituencies and show them that they have checked another one of the boxes of the list of promises that President Trump made during his time as a candidate for president. And then I think thirdly, you have to appreciate the fact that as far as President Trump is concerned, and from a marketing perspective, he's being, I think, rather coy in communicating one simple message here, and that is the issue of tariffs, and not really creating a lot of confusion about a lot of the other elements that go into the entire exercise. And that's why you see the various rounds of discussions, and there will, I suspect, be at least one or two more before anything of substance results from these current talks.
Tariffs are not the only word being used by the U.S. side toward China, Mr. Xie, but rather toward its allies as well. For example, Canada, EU countries, Mexico as well, with the steel issue. Of course, the two tariffs are different. One is more about punishment toward another economy. The other is mainly on one good, that is steel and aluminum. That's different. Having said that, though, it reminds people of, back in the 1960s and 70s. Mr. Puig could argue that the simple logic is for political debate and political achievements in the U.S., but, the word tariff being repeatedly used and used as a negotiation tool rather than others. What would it mean for the future trade negotiations, not just between the United States and the others, but also for the overall current status of the international trade? Mr. Xie.
Yeah, you're right. I think the overuse of the term tariffs in these few rounds of negotiation, or sort of one-sided policy from the U.S. to these allies, is really, I think, is going backwards. As you said correctly, the concept of tariffs is an old concept, and in fact is counterproductive, because the use of tariffs is actually dividing countries apart, right? So international trade should be a game of creating a bigger pie so that every country who participate in the trade would benefit from a bigger share of a bigger pie. But a tariff is actually working the other way, is kind of try to shrink the pie and therefore creating barriers or wars.
You try to punish the other
You
side.
punish the other one.
Rather
So
than
therefore,
seeking a common ground so that everybody could be the winner of different degrees.
exactly. So you're going backwards in a way.
Yeah. Mr. Guterres, Mr. Pruitt, the former Commerce Secretary serving the Bush era, earlier in the interview talked about you just cannot put a gun toward another person's head and say, sit down, negotiate, and give me the money. That only works in the Western movies, not necessarily in international trade negotiation. I think that's an interesting analogy, isn't it? The word and the threat of use of tariffs did remind us of a lot of things you see in the Westerns, in the Western movies, with the cowboys and things. But that doesn't work. So if it doesn't work, why do we pretend as if it works and therefore repeatedly use those phrases and create a mirage to even cheat other people? That's my big question, Mr. Pruitt.
Well, Tian, I think it's important, again, to separate facts from reality here. Many people in the world don't understand what's going on in America right now. It's clear that every day is a new edition of the ongoing reality series that we call the Trump administration here. So I have taken the position and continue to advise foreign officials who I've spoken with that, turn off the TV if you really want to focus on.
Except this program, Mr. Pruitt. Please tell them, except this program.
Except your program, that's right. Or change the channel. How's that?
Yeah, okay.
Change the channel and realize that much of the thinking that's driving the policy discussions here is based upon a reality program script.
Yeah.
Which is totally intended to entertain, not educate, and not necessarily result in the kind of achievements that we have historically seen in international trade negotiations.
But, Mr. Pruitt,
that, however, does not eliminate the requirement
we
to
understand
negotiate.
that there's a beautiful entertainment program going on in Washington every day, but the thing is, the business is going to pay their price. I mean, if you think about the bottom line of negotiation being twisting all the time, you definitely lose credibility. And therefore, if you do business with other parties, the other party is going to ask for a higher price because they have to count in the loss they would have to suffer as a result of changing a position all the time. So that is a key issue, the loss of credibility for American business and for people who are dealing with American business. It's a big issue. We're not talking about just jokes, entertainment movies, but rather real money being lost here, Mr. Pruitt.
Well, Tian, I agree that all of this is real money, and I think there are many people in America who appreciate the fact that it is real money. And in many sources now, folks are trying to change the discussion and not so much focus on the issue of tariffs themselves, but to point out to the American public that what we're really talking about is taxes that Americans are going to have to pay, because anytime you place tariffs on items, you raise the price of them, and these are things that Americans obviously want that are being brought in from China. So yes, there's two things going on here. Again, I think you have to focus on either one or the other, and not worry about what's going on the entertainment side of this equation. You're not going to change the fact that Donald Trump sees his nearly 40% rating in the polls as brand loyalty versus anything else in this discussion. He's going to continue to play to his brand in an attempt to maintain that support, much like he's done his entire professional life. And for the Chinese and other allies here, it is wise of them to focus on their agenda, their objectives here, and to negotiate in a very straightforward way, like the Chinese are now doing.
Here's the thing, Mr. Zhang. The strategy, that's what Mr. Pruitt seems to be suggesting. Of the other side, if you try to negotiate with the U.S. side, and if you try to figure out a way of your own in this chaotic, entangled situation. But what is going to be the strategy of China? That is a big question, isn't it? That you are dealing with an unpredictable partner, negotiator, and also you are dealing with unpredictable future of yours because you interact with the other side, which is the United States, in trade a lot.
Yeah.
So what could be the strategy coming to China's own economic development and pace of reform?
Yeah.
Mr. Zhang.
In China, we realize that actually in the future, China has to move to, innovation-oriented economic model. That's our own strategy. Also, we appreciate our, international economic cooperation with all of those partners due to globalization. Also, we are promoting both trade and investment liberalization and facilitation by free trade area and free trade experimental zone domestically, something like that. I'd like to emphasize that actually today, tariff reduction and, you have to move out all of those non-tariff barriers. Meanwhile, we have to provide investment facilitation. That would be constructive approach for both China's economy, U.S. economy, as well as global economy. On the contrary, if you create new tariffs, barriers, that would be disaster for all of us.
It will be disaster, but you cannot prevent others from doing what they want to do.
Of course.
You could only strategize your own path in order to avoid the further risks the other party might create as a result of their actions. Here comes the question then, Mr. Xie. China talk about reform opening up, its own pace, rhythm. But people want to see further reform in the financial sector. People want to see more market economy playing its bigger role here in China. So what about that? Will the negotiation taking place likely to be a constant basis, it seems, between China and the United States for a long way to go? Will it be able to create a momentum in China about further reform and opening up? To what extent, Mr. Xie?
Well, as you know, China has been opening up, over the last several decades. Since 40 years ago, really, it's been going on a gradual basis. Not everything is entirely opened up, but every sector is being opened up sort of over time. And I believe that whatever the negotiation with the U.S. government we're having will not deter China's overall strategy towards a gradual opening up and continue to reform, because ultimately this is going to be good for China and for the rest of the world.
Do you see signs of it?
I see signs of that.
Like what?
Like opening up of the auto industry that just been announced a couple of weeks ago, opening up more of the financial sectors. And in a way, China is very open in innovation and entrepreneurship. And as Mr. Zhang was saying, China is really focusing on innovation as the additional way to grow the economy in a potentially exponential manner. I think the Americans, in particular, the entrepreneurs and also American corporations, should really try to take part more in China innovation and to really take advantage of the dividends that they can reap from the result of China's innovation.
Well, the Chinese side is thinking about their own strategies, Mr. Pruitt, of trying to figure out a way in an entangled situation, not lose the ability to see the light at the end of the tunnel. What about American businesses? I mean, after all, American businesses are global businesses. And they have to deal with the unpredictability that they are seeing every day now as a result of what is going on in the negotiation room, and as a result of loss of credibility of the United States, as a matter of fact, as a result of the going on in the negotiation room. So, Mr. Pruitt, what do you think could be strategies for them?
Well, I think they are following the first order of of trade negotiations here, and that is to try and see if there is a real strategy behind what President Trump and the Trump administration are proposing. And I think at this juncture, the assessment of that is there is no strategy. Secondly, I would say that they are communicating, and in America we have multiple areas where pressure can be applied. Yeah. And unlike China, where you really kind of got a narrow path to walk, there are any number of pressure points here, and we saw initially when Trump threw the first stink bomb into the room, the farmers and others raised up their voices, and that resulted in what was then a move to put the current discussions about tariffs on hold. Again, I suspect that now that we've had this last round, and because there is deafening silence on the U.S. side as to what has come out of that, I suspect that the American corporate community will again rise up and start communicating through the various channels to force some significant achievement and negotiations here. And I think in one respect it's almost good that the ultimate outcome may not come in the public venue.
I see.
Because that then at least gives both parties the ability to claim victory, and I think at the end of the day that's going to have to be part of the equation here.
All right. Before we go, I want to have one sentence and one sentence only from every one of you gentlemen. What are the things that we should watch about whether there is going to be any further real discussions about U.S.-China trade? Of course, for the positive side. Let me go to you, Mr. Xie, first.
Yeah,
one sentence.
Yeah, I think the U.S. needs to be careful not to flip-flop too much in terms of these tactics, and China would need to stand on its principles.
I see, Mr.
I hope that U.S. side could be on the rational track and avoid to impose, tariffs, this type of extreme, policies. Also, we hope we can have constructive relationship.
I see. Last but not least, Mr. Pruitt.
Watch the activity on Wall Street, the commodities market, and the U.S. Congress. All
right, I got a list. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Steve Pruitt, Edward Xie, Zhang Jianping. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you so much. And you are watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China firms its support for humanitarian efforts for the Red Cross. I catch up with the organization's sitting president, Peter Maurer, who talks about seeking support for humanitarian missions. The full interview with ICRC president right after this break. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. As one of the most widely recognized emergency response organizations in the world, the International Committee of the Red Cross is a humanitarian institution based in Geneva, Switzerland, and three-time Nobel Prize laureate. The core of its approach is to help people in need during armed conflict, natural disasters, and other emergencies. Peter Maurer became the ICRC president on July the 1st, 2012. Under his leadership, the ICRC carries out humanitarian work in over 80 countries. China has always been supporting the ICRC's cause. Last week, Chinese Vice President Wang Qishan met with Maurer, pledging to firmly support the Red Cross work. I caught up with Maurer recently. Listen in on the conversation about negotiating with all parties to cope with humanitarian disasters. And I'm joined here by Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. What a pleasure to see you, sir.
Thanks
here
for
in
having
Beijing.
Me.
Good to have you. I understand you're here to talk to the Chinese side about the future mission of ICRC, the cooperation, and also about the Belt and Road Initiative. But I want to begin about ICRC worldwide, Mr. President. You have more than 1,000 attacks against ICRC staff over just the past few months around the world. I wondered how you, as the president, are going to protect your staff.
Well, we have a very special philosophy on protecting our staff. Our philosophy has always been that we have to be in contact, in proximity to the belligerents. We have to talk to the belligerents. We have to explain what we are doing in the field, because without the consent of the different parties to a conflict, we can't operate in the field.
But then it is your job to talk to the different parties of the conflict, and yet you have to remain neutral all the time. That's really tricky.
When we talk to the one side, this is often seen as partial by the other side. But I think in 155 years we have managed to credibly demonstrate that we are always talking to all sides.
You were on some of the earlier missions yourself. You went to visit field trips as well. So how did you handle some of the specific cases? Can you give an example?
Well, look, for instance, in Syria, it is important that in some of the besieged areas that I have visited during the Syrian conflict, that we have been able to talk to the different groups. For instance, in Homs, we have spoken to the Al-Nusra Front, which was besieged by the Syrian army. And it was important for myself and for my colleagues in the field to have a clear idea what the position and the situation of the different groups were, and to negotiate ceasefires, or at least to negotiate agreement that during certain hours of the day, for certain activities of ICRC which would bring assistance to people, that we would be protected.
What is really that
attacked.
magical touch that would get deals done?
Well, there is no
I'm sure
magical...
you know some of the secrets behind the scenes.
There is no magical touch, but there is nothing else but being honest, transparent, and clear. To do what you say and to say what you do. When you are in such a situation, when you visit a besieged area, you must not promise what you can't hold. You have to say, under these and these conditions, I will probably be able to deliver food or medicine, and this kind of medicine. You shouldn't promise that you can bring a field hospital if you can't bring a field hospital. You shouldn't promise that you can fix the water installation when you can't.
Don't overpromise.
Don't overpromise.
And always walk the talk.
Always walk the talk, and always be an honest broker, as we call it, a neutral intermediary between belligerents. Always be mindful of the fact that ICRC, as a neutral intermediary, you are not the actor. You have seen, for instance, that we have negotiated for more than 18 months to be able to bring the Chibok girls from the Boko Haram to the Nigerian government, or some of them to the Nigerian government. These are long processes of trust and confidence building, and it is important that we keep silent, we keep also confidential in those relationships, because once in the middle of a negotiation you are starting to talk, that's normally the end of the negotiation.
Another trick, Mr. President, I'm sure you and your colleague have to face is the balance. On the one hand, you have to make sure people understand your profile on an international basis, and therefore you have to talk about yourself. But on the other hand, you cannot talk about yourself in a way to make yourself a player in a conflict, or make yourself a noticeable party for others to knock on your door and try to let you to solve the problem.
Our mandate, agreed upon by states, by the international community, is to assist and protect people. So you have to credibly demonstrate that when you engage, when you negotiate, when you try to negotiate and to carve out that neutral and impartial space, that it is not in your interest, in your institutional interest, but it has to have a result which has an impact, and a positive impact for people. What
is the most important quality? Is it humanitarian heart, or is it bravery, or is the art of communication? What exactly is it?
I would even start with a fourth one, which you haven't mentioned. It is the ability to gain trustful relationship with belligerents and to negotiate humanitarian spaces. Negotiating that space is difficult because we know that war is one of the most extreme situations in which emotions and positions are far away between those people with whom we interact each and every day.
I'm afraid, Mr. President, unfortunately, the world is not necessarily getting better if you look at the spots of violence. What is driving the world to be where we are today and where we're going to be according to the ICRC perspective?
Well, I would first agree with you that the trend doesn't look very promising. We have more people displaced than any time since the Second World War. We have more people living in what we call situations of fragility, which are situations where poverty, corruption, underdevelopment and violence are combined. If we look at death toll by firearms, the death toll by firearms is in Latin American cities, in some of the cities is higher than in Syria or Iraq. Everybody only looks at Syria and Iraq as consequences of conflict. So we are coping with difficult trends of poverty, bad governance, underdevelopment, violence, and violence destroying development.
That's a lot.
That's a lot, and that's a lot.
Why do you think, Mr. President, I'm sure it is not just the reality you're looking at, you're also looking at the backdrop of the reality and the root causes of it. What is leading us to where we are?
We have big divergences amongst states at global, at regional, and within countries at national level. So one of the challenges is that maybe in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, where we were dealing with quite localized conflicts, which were negative for people still. Today we are confronted with an enormous amount of countries and situations where local, national, regional and global dynamic work into each other. The Syrian conflict is a conflict amongst Syrians, but it is also a conflict about regional powers and regional influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So is the Yemeni conflict, and at the same time it is a power struggle in which big powers are involved. The Europeans, the Americans, the Russians are involved. So we see an international order where diplomacy has difficulties finding consensus and finding solutions for some of the problems.
Mr. President, I'm sure as the President of ICRC, you have been in debates and been hearing debates about globalization and also the different interpretations of globalization. Where do you think the world is going? Is the system that has been established since the Second World War going to a negative area in which not as many as should members of the international community are subscribing to it? And therefore, what does that mean?
We see negative humanitarian impact of the situations that you have described. I don't deny. But what I also see, it's not only a question of attitude, it's also a question of reality. When I go to the field, I see hundreds and thousands of people resisting the downfall of their lives. They take their destinies in their own hands. They look to create a business out of the worst situation. I see resilience of populations, which I would never have believed, that people are so resilient, so assiduously trying to make their life a better life. I think what we need is also political signals that there is hope. And
what kind of political signals you are
Well,
talking
I
about?
think we need also political signals coming out of the international community that there is solidarity, that there are countries there to help, that there is a perspective for those who resist the downfall, the downgrading, the disintegration of their society, that we help them find a perspective for the future. I think when I listen carefully to most of the victims I'm meeting in the battlefields, what they are lacking most is a perspective for the future, is a little bit of help. They don't dream about the glitter and the glamour of the international world. They dream about having a decent life.
But Mr. President, let me go to another area of discussion with you. We see now various governments have questions about their international aid or development aid agencies. You even see the budget of these agencies in some countries, or the importance of these agencies diminishing over the years, which put us to the question for you. As the president of ICRC, where do you get your money? I understand you got it very well. Money is important for you. Yet the trend, I don't know whether you have noticed or not.
Well, I would notice the trend, and I would very frankly say there is always a legitimate concern that when you put money into an enterprise, you want to know what exactly the impact of that money is. I think our magic word here is accountability towards those who offer money to us. And I think that's part of a dialogue we have to have with donors, that we have to convince donors that what we do has an impact for people. If you want to have an impact, you have to be there. You have to be close to where things happen, and you have to control what happens with the money, and you have to be accountable for what you are doing.
That's a lot of missions that you have listed for yourself and your staff, I have to say,
Sure.
Mr. President. Talking about ICRC cooperation with China, we understand the system is ICRC is operating in the international circumstance, while the China's Red Cross is having different missions. So how in the future China will become, on the one hand, supporting financially to ICRC, on the other hand, having more cooperation with ICRC? What is your vision?
It is definitely our interest to have more Chinese support for our response, and at the same time tap into the potential and the skills and the human resources skills of an organization like the Chinese Red Cross. I think just recently I visited the Democratic Republic of the Congo. A week before, we had a visit from the Chinese Red Cross to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we are working together to see whether the Chinese Red Cross can make a contribution to the overall response of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement in the Democratic Republic of the Congo by providing, for instance, a field hospital. This is a concrete example of a cooperation I am envisaging in the future. So we hope that the Chinese Red Cross can channel more of its skilled humanitarian worker into international operations, while ICRC is very open as well here in China to offer its international experience, advice for whatever the Chinese Red Cross would like to do and is going to do here in China.
Mr. President, I understand you met with the Vice President of People's Republic of China, Mr. Wang Qishan, during your trip this time. And you, the two of you, talk about cooperation along the Belt and Road Initiative. Of course, this is a global vision, but exactly what will be some of the very basic steps to begin with?
My point is, when I look at the countries on the Belt and Road, they are at the same time fragile countries and places where ICRC is active.
Some of them are.
At least some of them. We counted more than 40 who are countries in which ICRC has operations. And I think our work is more a contribution on the stability of societies and is more designed also to help people cope and to prepare people for more ambitious development. So what I proposed to the Chinese interlocutor is that we should think about the Belt and Road not only in terms of a infrastructural development, but also to think about a humanitarian Belt and Road, connecting people and helping people, again, to find a certain perspective and to create preconditions under which development can happen. And one of the preconditions is that we get away with the negative impact of conflict.
Yes, indeed. Mr. President, before we go, there's one issue people are looking at, and they are looking at closely around the world. That is what's going to happen with the DPRK. There's a negotiation likely to take place. People applaud that, but we do not know the potential of that, and if things are not necessarily going well, what is likely to be the humanitarian situation in that country and in the region as well. From the perspective of ICRC, how do you see that?
The fact that talks are underway and there is at least a certain perspective that some of the most intrinsic political issues on the Korean Peninsula may be solved or brought towards a more positive dynamic. And this would certainly be extremely helpful also in order to solve some of the intrinsic humanitarian issues that we were dealing with over the last decades. We see a positive development in the future, and that this positive development will not only lead to the disarmament, the nuclear disarmament on the Korean Peninsula, but will also pay in terms of interests of people. And interests of people start with having clarity on where your relatives are, being able to see, to meet, to travel, and then starts, of course, also with addressing more prominently some of the humanitarian challenges, in particular in the north.
Yes, indeed. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. What a pleasure to have you, sir. All the best.
Thanks
Thank you
a lot
for being with us.
your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.